That's such a fascinating history, and I just have like a million questions just based on
Yes.
what you said. Because I mean, it's parallel to Indian policy, Indian child removal policy, and I really like what Jen had brought up too. Because I was thinking something along the similar lines in terms of how in indigenous studies we're taught that looking at the U.S. war on terror and its origins within the Indian wars, but you're really challenging us to think further back. And one thing that I couldn't help but think about as you were talking is the doctrine of discovery, and thinking about the year 1492, not just because it's the year that Columbus crossed the Atlantic Ocean, but it's really the year that the Spanish crown consolidated its power. And Mahmoud Mamdani in his book Neither Settler Nor Native argues that's also the year of the founding of the modern state for exactly the same reasons that you're pointing out, meaning that it was an attempt by the Spanish crown to not only create a policy of tolerance, big scare quotes right there, to how it's going to manage its internal minorities, or to make what were once majority populations into minority populations that could be then ruled by through Christian authority and domination. But thinking about how this also spurred, a kind of an era of quote unquote exploration and discovery, and how as you pointed out, it became externalized to other parts of the globe and was codified within legal doctrine. With the Pope asserting in 1493 that explorers could essentially claim foreign territory in the name of Christendom, and that such claims were legitimate because the inhabitants or the nations were discovered, and the lands lacked European civilization, principally Christianity. And so in this way, like, Indians in the Americas became Moors and Jews on the other side of the ocean, so to speak. So I was wondering if you could maybe, like, I don't know if that's something that you've explored in your own research, but how because it goes back to one of the points that you brought up at the beginning of this discussion, and how there's this kind of critical dialectic between what we know as foreign policy and domestic policy. And we're seeing the rise of a modern state, both principally constructed by kind of this external, colonization process that's happening in the Americas, while also kind of managing its internal minorities through tolerance and indirect rule, i.e. assimilating them into Christendom itself.
Yeah, well, that's a really big topic. I mean, I'm not really an expert in the Atlantic world component of it. I just see some continuities, and I don't want to say that it's the same thing, or that the encounter with indigenous peoples immediately meant that they just categorized them in the same way or treated them the same way as the Moors or the Jews, because they also were capable of making new distinctions. And there was an important factor. There were ideas of like civilization and societies, and if you had this was the problem for them with Judaism and Islam, is that they could recognize that it had components of, structured religion, it had scriptures, it had theology, there were cities, so there were enough in the world of the Mediterranean, there were enough similarities that made the differences, in that kind of narcissism of smaller differences, very, very meaningful for patterning their relations, and how they saw the threat. But when it came to, and when they encountered sophisticated societies and cultures like the Aztecs that, had a lot of these, features, or, great monuments and all of that, they had to figure out, then do we sort of treat them as Moors and as Jews, essentially, just as non-Christians, or, are they pagans, i.e. people without an organized confessional form of religion? And, in many ways, that opened up more possibilities for enslavement, for, different kinds of policies, and also opportunities for missionizing that had been stymied in the Mediterranean. Because let's, be real. I mean, I just did a podcast recently talking about Francis of Assisi, who, I think is a very interesting saint and a fascinating figure. He was very significant in this missionizing sort of effort, however. But the problem during the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries was that it didn't work. It was impossible, it seemed, to expand Christendom through missionizing in in the Mediterranean world. And so what they started to develop was a justification of conquest for the sake of missionizing, that they recognized and realized that without controlling and dominating the society militarily, it was difficult to create the right conditions in which to convert, these populations. So they justified conquest as a way to advance Christianization. And I think one thing that they found and discovered in the Americas was a greater ability to use violence successfully to control these societies and advance missionizing. Through suppressing indigenous religions, or sometimes, of course, also finding ways to, as had been the case even on the continent of Europe, its Christianization took a while, partly because they needed to create forms of Christianity that could appropriate and assimilate and incorporate, pagan holy sites and holy places, but repattern them and give them a new narrative. And so this kind of syncretic process of religious interaction was something that, took place in Europe, and it also, of course, ends up taking place in the Americas. So I think I've gone off in a different direction, because religious history is always so interesting to me as a scholar of these different religions. But I think the main point that you were getting at is that there are these continuities, or at least the value of a longue durée perspective is not to say, oh, it's all the same and it's always been happening in exactly the same way, but to recognize that despite the various complexities, subtleties, and nuances of each contextual moment and each different period, that nonetheless certain things are accomplished and certain things can be built upon from the legacies of these patterns before. It's not that they just adopt exactly what went before, but it's clear that there are there is a kind of knowledge that is built up about how do we deal with these kinds of conditions of conquest and of subjected populations, of religious difference, of ethnic and racial and cultural difference, that there's a long period of training in certain ways under the conditions of a very diverse and contested Mediterranean that informs, it's no accident that, Christopher Columbus, was a Genoese, merchant. I mean, the Genoese were the biggest slavers of the Mediterranean. They had a global network for, getting slaves from the Black Sea and bringing them into the Mediterranean. And they believed that at a certain point, 30 or 40% of the actual population of the Republic of Genoa were enslaved people. Now, of course, they had no rights, they had no political, outlet, and it was a republic, but it's just these were not enfranchised peoples. And so it's no wonder that people like him from that sort of milieu had developed the, sailing and navigational ability, that technical element, but other forms of knowledge as well. How do you classify and deal with people who are different? If you look at Genoese records, they have an incredibly rich, if you want to put it that way, vocabulary for describing ethnic and racial and religious difference, because they had to classify all of these peoples that they had enslaved and purchased and how to sell them. And so this kind of knowledge of colonialism, of enslavement in commercial terms, these kinds of knowledges were valuable when they come into the Atlantic world. Now it gets transformed. You have the plantation complex. You have, circuits of capital that expand this dramatically in different ways. But they're starting from a position of having been informed by conflicts and the experience of managing and dealing with diversity, in the Mediterranean world when they come into the Atlantic.